Hi there. I have this idea that the transcendental experience is literally like you could make yourself so small or so thin that you would literally go under the crack in the door. So there's the door there, and you're literally sort of have the ability to go underneath the door, which is closed. So we're not even going to open the door, we're going to just go underneath it. And that would be a pretty amazing experience, a subtle experience, if you could experience it as if you were experiencing, I don't know, a tree or the door itself. And I started off this contemplation by thinking that the five senses um, really tell me that this world of pleasure and pain, of sweet, sour, and salt, are is the ultimate reality. There isn't anything else because there's nothing else beyond the senses. But of course, then people will come back to me and say, "What about visions?" We'll come back to those in a minute. What about dreams? What about fantasies, reveries, things like that? Um, what about the experience of, I don't know, lights in the sky and of ghosts and other strange paranoia, paranormal so-called visitations or experiences. And these are gathered by the senses, of course. You have to have the senses to look at a ghost. You have to have the senses uh, to experience a dream to a certain degree. I don't know about visions and fantasies. You're sort of experiencing them on some sensuous level. And even visions, I mean, it depends. I had a vision of the whole house burning down, but that was because I was under such acute distress at the time. And people under stress and distress often have visions. You could say the visions of Joan of Arc were due to her distress, and but she wasn't actually doing anything at the time, as far as I know. She was just a simple peasant girl, just minding her own business, and suddenly this vision of Saint Anne and Mary and Saint Catherine popped into her mind. Of course, she had the context of being, a Catholic, obviously, and being in a village where everybody was Catholic, where the local priest was the shaman of the village. So she had a religious context in which to have that vision. So you could say that the vision was built up of all her experiences with the local village church, and the experience of the church, of the mass, and the various sacraments of the church which were administered to her and her family and to friends and loved ones, during her young life in the village. So everything is built, it seems, on an appreciation and a perception of reality of real life. And so, if we're going to find this butterfly, which is another name for the soul, which is the literal meaning of soul, if we're going to find this butterfly, it's going to be so totally other and so totally outside our experience of this world that it's going to be very, very hard to be sure whether we have experienced it or not. Because by definition, it won't be anything that is almost possible to be experienced if it's so outside our senses. And if it's some kind of doorway to another, to like the visions and fantasies and dreams, you could argue it's still being built on the reality which we know about through our senses. So it's going to be quite an amazing experience, or it's going to be such a subtle experience that it really almost goes under the radar, as it were, of the senses and even of our inner perception. And I sort of have an idea in my head that, like in the Upanishads, seem to intimate that there is a self referring part of consciousness, the sort of awareness of thought, the awareness that I am thinking something, and that during introspection or during meditation, you go sort of inner and inner and inner, inwards and inwards and inwards until there is a sort of a complete silence, a complete emptiness, and perhaps not even an awareness of thought, of the fact that you are thinking anymore. And this would be a chance of samadhi, as they say, samadhi. Um, and then perhaps arising from that, as you're coming down from this trance, there would be a certain experience. But even that is kind of like not what I'm really talking about either. I'm fussy. I just don't. I've kind of this demand of myself that it's something that's not even that. Um, people often take drugs, and when they're coming down from the drugs, they have visions and other things like that. But these are all abnormalities of consciousness, random firing of neurons. What I'm talking about is beyond even the brain itself, beyond even the firing of neurons in a random way or in an ordered way, for that matter. And there is no emotion, there is no rational mind, there is no sensation, there is no detection of the outer world through the senses. There is just a sort of a brief or passing intuition of something which really, really is a sort of, which is so ethereal, ephemeral, I suppose, that you can't really uh, put it put any, you can't really ascribe any experience. You can't compare it to any experience that you ever had. And that would be an interesting experience in itself, if it were possible to experience that. And certainly the only thing that you can experience is the longing for this transcendental moment, which outcompetes every other experience you've ever had. So the longing is certainly there, and you can introspect on that longing. You can go into the very depths of that longing through some kind of sustained contemplation. But always you are brought back to the to your experience of so-called reality, obviously because you're distracted by your body or by your mind or by your emotions or by something. Um, but then again, I was walking through the garden this morning, and I stumbled in the mud and in the dark, and it seemed to me that I lost all sense of self at that moment. I lost all sense of self-reference as I instinctively tried to come out of the skid, come out of the stumble and the mud, and my whole sort of instinctively, my whole mind was focused on staying upright, you know, and of course you can often break a limb, break an arm by instinctively you put your arm out to stop yourself from falling, and then you fall on your arm and break it. Whereas if you just sort of went with the fall in a sort of floppy kind of way, you might not break anything at all. It's the resistance to falling that often causes the actual fracture of the bone. Anyway, it seemed to me that at that moment of stumbling, I lost all sense of self-reference, whereas I had been in a state of self-referencing and thinking and contemplating as I was walking around the garden. Perhaps not a good idea to do that in the mud and the dark. You should have your senses, your wits about you when you're wandering around even a familiar piece of ground in the dark, because You just can't see what's ahead of you or what's underneath you or what's under you. And it was very muddy as well. So, you have this, to go back to this analogy with the door, if it's going to be something which slips under, which goes under the radar of the senses and of internal detection, and comparing to some experience you've had before in the unconscious, it's going to have to be something which is incredibly subtle, and incredibly perhaps linked to the longing itself rather than to any experience. It's you keep on saying, no, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. You just like, you keep on rejecting all experiences and all thoughts until there's perhaps hardly anything left in the test tube. It's all kind of boiled away, it's all distilled away, and then you're left with something, that which remains, and that which remains could be something which is which it is possible to experience. And the point about my story about stumbling in the dark and the mud, it's going to be an experience which really takes you beyond your current consciousness. So it's going to be an experience which is so overwhelming, that it's like stumbling in the dark. It can't, you can't ignore it. You can't ignore it. You're going to fall into that experience. You're going to have that moment when basically you are not who you think you are anymore, but you are kind of whisked away. But even then, you might say, well, what's the difference between that and a dream, or that and a vision, or that in some kind of strong fantasy, or some kind of drug-induced hallucination? That can be so overwhelming that you kind of like a conscious hiccup, that it overtakes your whole consciousness. I'm talking about something which is on one hand overwhelming, like the stumbling in the dark, or like hitting your funny bone, and you've got intense pain. So something which overwhelms you on one hand, and yet on the other hand, you still retain your self-referencing consciousness. So that's kind of what I'd be looking for in this experience, this numinous experience of the ineffable, of the spiritual, as opposed to the material. Or even, I'm not even looking for fantasy, vision, and dream and reverie, because that's a kind of, you might call that materialized spirit. I'm looking for something which, uh, which is basically beyond who I am, and yet at the same time not beyond who I am, or not beyond my I am, I think, therefore I am, or I am, therefore I think. I still retain that awareness, and yet I'm sort of taken into this other world. It is a bit like a computer game, really. With computer games, you are who you are. You're still you. Yet at the same time, you are your avatar as well. You are the character in the dream if it's first person. In the game, you're that first person in the game, and yet you're still the person sitting at the computer, watching the game. So you're acting in the game at the same time as being passively watching the game, or watching yourself playing the computer game, I suppose. Although sometimes if computer games get really intense, if the gameplay is really intense, then you do go into sort of fantasy. You actually lose all sense of self to the computer game if it's really intense. But that would be like an anomaly. Most of the time, you'd be kind of aware that you're playing a computer game, or even that you're aware watching a movie, or watching, or reading a book, or looking at a piece of art. You're still aware of who you are, even at the same time as you're sort of taken out of yourself at the same time. So whatever this numinous experience is, it's going to be on the level of great subtlety, and yet great familiarity as well. So you kind of think, oh, I've seen this before, and yet you don't know who you are in relation to the experience. Um, so I mean, as I said, I'm a fussy person. I'm looking for this crack in the door or crack in the floor. I'm looking for this butterfly. I'm looking to actually say, no, that's not it. That's not it. And through a process of intense elimination and rejection of all experiences, apart from the one that will seem to me to be familiar on one hand and to be totally other on the other, if you see what I mean. Or maybe you don't.